one day, tired of all the religions of the world, a young man decided to visit a wise man and inquire from him on whether the world needed religion or not. To answer his question, the wise man gave the young man a story that went like this. Once upon a time, a man who claimed to be a prophet decided to start a church in a certain town. At first, the prophet was very likable. His sermons were genuine, his motives were heavenly bound, and in his heart all he wanted was to see people change from their bad ways and live holy lives. The people of that town embraced his teachings, and soon enough, his church was always packed with thousands of congregants. To accommodate everyone, the prophet decided to open up other church branches across the town, and each church was assigned a preacher who would answer directly to the prophet. As is the norm, the more congregants a church has, the bigger the size of their offerings. With branches all across town that had a huge following, the prophet's church used to have a collective offering of over $1 million. As the saying goes, money is the root of all evil in the world. The more the money the prophet and his preachers collected, the more they started gearing their preaching towards money. They told the congregants if they needed more blessings, they should tithe more, give more offerings, and so forth. And because no one hates blessings, as innocent as they were, the congregants went to extreme levels in tithing and offerings. However, on the side of the prophet and his preachers, they would take the money, share it amongst themselves, and they went ahead to live lavish lifestyles. So one day, the prophet disappeared for like 2 weeks, and when he resurfaced, his congregants were so pleased to see him. He told them that he had gone to the mountains to fast and pray, and now the heavens had given him the power to forgive sin. Like the brainwashed fellas they were, the congregants applauded their prophet as they sung songs of celebration. However, the prophet told them, for one to have their sins fully forgiven, one had to pay a certain amount of money depending on the magnitude of the sin. For example, if you committed adultery, you would pay a higher fee than a person who only told a lie. According to the prophet, murderers would pay the highest fee for them to be fully forgiven. And as if that wasn't strange enough, the prophet also told the congregants that one could even pay for their future sins, and a receipt would be issued to show that you had already paid for that specific sin. For example, assuming you wanted to cheat on your wife, let's say on the coming weekend, you could go to the prophet, pay for the sin in advance, get a receipt for it, and so cheating on your wife wouldn't be a sin anymore because you've paid for it and you are already forgiven. The prophet and his preachers made it clear to the people that with their sins fully paid for, if they died, they would go straight to heaven. And because everyone wanted to go to heaven, the congregants came in droves to pay for their sins. The prophet also worked with crooked politicians who would ensure that no harm would come to those people who had paid for their future sins when they commit them. In return, the politicians got fat checks. Within no time, business was so booming for the prophet and his preachers. They decided to buy trucks that would go around the town collecting money from people for the sins they had committed, or the sins they would commit in the near future. By the end of the day, the trucks would be loaded with money that would later be deposited into the prophet's bank account. So one day, a group of 20 young men who were unhappy with the way the prophet and his preachers were exploiting the congregation, decided to teach the prophet a lesson. They went to the prophet and told him that they wanted to commit a terrible sin in the near future, and so they wanted to pay for it in advance for forgiveness. Driven by greed, the prophet inquired what their sin was, so that he could know how much he could charge them. The young men told him that they intended to commit murder and robbery. They then told the prophet because they didn't have cash, they would pay for their sins with gold. At this point, the prophet's eyes widened with greed, quickly accepted their offer, got paid, and in return he gave them receipts for the crimes they would commit in future. Knowing very well that no one would come between them and their crime now that they had paid for it, the young men went back to the drawing board to finalize their plans. On their appointed day of crime, the young men did a thing that no one had imagined. With each man carrying their receipts to show they had paid for their sins in advance, the young men subdivided themselves into 5 groups. Armed with crude weapons, one group hijacked the church's truck after it had collected sinning fee in town, killed everyone on board, and stole all the money. The other groups went on a killing spree, killing all the prophet's preachers, and eventually killing the prophet himself. When they were later arrested, each man produced his receipt in court showing that they had paid for the sin in advance, and so they were guiltless. The judge found this case to be interesting, and he eventually set the young men free cause indeed, they had done nothing wrong. The misfortune that had befell the prophet and his preachers were their own doing. After the story, the wise man told the young man, "My son, now to answer your question, religion by itself isn't bad. It's the people who manipulate it to suit their own selfish gains that are bad and evil.